Hi, and welcome to part 2 of week 3. Early Renaissance sculpture. A great deal of Renaissance art served as architectural decoration. Many architects, like Brunelleschi, were also sculptors or painters. As we learned in part 1, long before raising the dome of the Florence Cathedral, Filippo Brunelleschi entered a competition for the commission of a set of bronze doors for the north side of the cathedral's baptistry. He lost to Lorenzo Ghiberti, who himself was a painter. Ghiberti also won the commission for the east doors, the so-called Gates of Paradise, which were all celebrated as a triumph of Florentine art. The panels of the east doors incorporated the new Renaissance concept of perspectival spatial depth. You can see more about Renaissance perspective on page 608. This is especially apparent in one of the panels of this that we're going to see on the screen here shortly, Jacob and Esau. Get that back up on the screen so you can see that. All right. Ghiberti enhanced the realism of the space in this panel by making the foreground figures three-dimensional. And you can sort of see this in this image. You can see where it looks like some of the figures are kind of sticking out of the frame, but you can really see it in a photograph I took while standing in front of the doors. You can see how three-dimensional they look. In true self-conscious Renaissance fashion, Ghiberti wrote about his techniques and his commentaries for the benefit of contemporaries and future readers, and of course, to cement his lasting fame. Relief sculptures, like the panels of the Gates of Paradise, was important, but life-size sculpture surged in importance in a way that hadn't since the Roman era. You may recall from Module 1 that one important religious structure in Florence was Or San Michele. Around the same time as the Bronze Doors competition, the church gave 12 niches on the exterior to all the major guilds of Florence. You can see these niches here. Each guild commissioned a life-size image of its patron saint for his niche. Four Crowned Martyrs by Nanni di Banco is an excellent example of an early Renaissance sculpture group. You can see it here and up close. These figures not only interact with each other, but invite the viewer to confer with them. The inclusion of the viewer in the composition is a common feature of sculpture of this project, which you can see more of at Or San Michele's website, linked in the online module. Di Banco's group also has the appearance of ancient Greek or Roman sculpture in their antique-looking clothes and relaxed contrapposto stances. Aside from Ghiberti and Di Banco, whose career was very short, probably the most famous and influential early Renaissance sculptor was Donatello. Donatello could work in relief or in the round, as in his piece for the Or San Michele project, or his famous David of 1446, which you can see there. In that this David is nude, it is especially good at demonstrating the concept of contrapposto in its hip-shot pose. Donatello's David is an excellent example of Italian Renaissance artist antiquarianism. The David is especially important as the first life-size nude created since the fall of ancient Rome. Along with the life-size nude, early Renaissance sculptors also took the equestrian statue format from antique Greek and Roman art. On the screen you can see the Gattamelata by Donatello. This monument was erected to a condottiero, or mercenary general, of Padua. This and other equestrian monuments emulated the ancient Roman bronze sculpture of Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. The sculpture of Marcus Aurelius is one of only a handful of bronze sculptures from the ancient world to survive the Middle Ages, during which time many bronzes were melted down and used for armor, weapons, or other items. This was justified by the so-called pagan nature of these sculptures, which, since they were pre-Christian, were considered fair game for destruction. The Marcus Aurelius survived because it was mistakenly identified as Emperor Constantine, who was considered to be the first Christian Roman emperor. Early Renaissance painting. While the beginning of the 15th century marked major changes in architecture and sculpture, Panel painters largely ignored many of the new ways of depicting the human figure in architecture. In panel paintings, neither nudity nor antique structures can be found until the last few decades of the century. But fresco painting, on the other hand, embraced the new Renaissance style early on. Fresco painters created large compositions on murals of churches and residences. Fresco painting, as we learned in week 1, involves applying watery pigment to wet plaster, a difficult technique to learn. Inspiration came not only in the new Renaissance ideas of perspective and realistic figures, but also in the late Gothic artist Giotto, whose work we saw in week 1. Early Renaissance fresco artist Masaccio's most important work, the Holy Trinity of the Church of Santa Maria Novella in Florence, is a perfect example of linear one-point perspective, a technique that made a more realistic spatial depth possible in 2 dimensions. See Renaissance Perspective on page 610. You can see in the photo on the screen and the diagram on page 611 how Masaccio utilized architectural elements like ceiling tiles of a Roman style called coffers to create a realistic illusion of space. His figures are round and solid, almost sculptural, and so resemble Giotto's figures in the Arena Chapel. Masaccio's architectural elements are classical, referring to ancient Greco-Roman structures, like this here. All of these qualities made Masaccio the most influential of early Renaissance fresco artists. Masaccio also used linear perspective in the frescoes of the Brancacci Chapel of the Church of Santa Maria della Carmine, also in Florence. The Brancacci Chapel is also a typical Renaissance commission in that it was a chapel belonging to and commissioned by a private wealthy family. In his tribute money, Masaccio uses linear perspective that is apparent in the way the architecture is visible to the viewer, from an angle. He also paints several figures with their backs turned to us, or in 3/4 view, which enhances the realism of the space. The expulsion from paradise, or Adam and Eve, utilizes perspective and foreshortening, but also clearly is inspired by Giotto in the emotionalism of the figures. Other Italian painters picked up on these new Renaissance style characteristics. They, like Masaccio, created works that were talked about by other artists and by scholars. Fra Angelico, for example, though a humble monk, gained the patronage of the Medici family, and through that wealthy benefactor was able to adorn the walls of the San Marco Monastery in Florence with beautiful frescoes. The most readily recognized is from the stairs to the monks' quarters, the Annunciation, which you're seeing on the screen. Fra Angelico's frescoes, while not particularly realistic in their portrayal of human anatomy, are created with linear perspective in mind and with a Brunelleschi-inspired architectural aesthetic. Andrea del Castagno's Last Supper is also viewed within an abbey, the convent of Santa Apollonia in Florence. As is typical, the Last Supper subject matter was chosen for the refectory or dining hall. Like Masaccio's Holy Trinity, when viewed from precisely in front of it, Castagno's Last Supper looks perfectly perspectival. Also like Masaccio's work, Castagno's fresco makes use of ceiling tiles, right here, along with floor tiles and architectural lines, in order to create the illusion of realistic space. It's only when we view it off-center that the illusion is broken. See that here. Andrea Mantegna, another prolific early Renaissance artist, became adept at the spatial technique called foreshortening. Here we are. Foreshortening is defined by Stockstad as an illusion in which figures appear to recede or sharply project into space. Unlike perspective, mastery of foreshortening was developed not through mathematics, but through observation of reality. Mantegna made several masterworks of foreshortening, including the Lamentation on the screen, which was clearly created to showcase this talent. Mantegna was so talented at foreshortening that he was hired to create images called di sotto in su. Di sotto in su means from directly below, like his frescoes on the walls and the ceiling of the Camera Picta. The Camera Picta, which means painted room, is in the Ducal Palace of Mantua, and it was painted for Lodovico Gonzaga. You can see the ceiling here, where it looks like an oculus with little kids and animals and plants that look like they're about to fall on you in a humorous way. Foreshortening and perspective were also utilized by Paolo Uccello and Piero della Francesca. Uccello's triumphant Battle of San Romano depicts a war as if it were a play on a set, on an unlikely and perspectival stage. An unlikely and perfectly perspectival stage, with bodies and dropped lances creating parallel and perpendicular lines. Della Francesca's flagellation provides another excellent example of perspective, while his resurrection displays his knowledge of foreshortening of the figures. One of Piero della Francesca's most famous works is his double portrait, see that here, of Battista Sforza and Federico da Montefeltro, the Duke and Duchess of Urbino. This is partly a tribute or memorial to Battista. She had died 2 years earlier from her husband Federico. In this way, the double portrait is a visual form of the love poetry of the early Renaissance. It may be interesting to note the profile of Federico, whose face was disfigured, a broken nose and missing eye. Federico was a true Renaissance duke in his prolific patronage of art. His studiolo, or library, is filled with paintings and decorated with gorgeous wood inlay known as intarsia. In panel paintings of the late 15th century, especially for private commissions, some artists embraced the new Neoplatonic humanist philosophies. Centro Botticelli's Birth of Venus and its companion Primavera were likely created as a pair and probably were made for a member of the Medici family. As a duo, they functioned as commentary on the Neoplatonic idea of sacred or universal love, which is represented by Birth of Venus, versus profane or earthly love, represented by Primavera. This is key to understanding the Renaissance artist and his or her choices. Botticelli can really only safely paint purely mythological scenes like these if they can be interpreted as allegories of Catholic beliefs. As we learned in week 1, there is no freedom of or from religion, even in the more free-thinking humanistic Renaissance. In fact, Vatican commissions remained very important in the early Renaissance. Pope Sixtus IV built the Sistine Chapel shortly before the restoration of Rome after the Western Schism, which you can read about in the linked lecture. Sixtus IV hired several of the most renowned artists to decorate this new chapel. Yes, it is the same Sistine Chapel that Michelangelo would decorate later. The delivery of the keys by Perugino was symbolic of the power of Rome, where St. Peter was believed to have begun the Catholic Church as the first pope. It's also a study in new Renaissance ideals, as it presents perspective and another version of the ideal city, as we discussed in part 1. This concludes our lecture on the early Renaissance period in Italy. Next week's module takes us to the High Renaissance in Italy.